the champagne flute in Cassandra's hand didn't shake. That was the part she would remember later. How steady her hands were, even as her entire world quietly split open at the seams. They were at Harbor Grand, one of those restaurants in downtown Toronto where the lighting is dim enough to make everyone look expensive, and the menu doesn't list prices because the people who eat there don't need to know. Her husband Elliot had reserved the private dining room on the upper floor, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the waterfront. Outside, the lake stretched dark and flat, and the CN Tower glowed orange against a January sky. Everything looked exactly the way money was supposed to look. The dinner was meant to impress Monsieur Bertrand Lacroix, a Quebecois investor who was considering putting $22 million into Elliot's construction consulting firm before it went public in the spring. Cassandra had been invited because Elliot always brought her to these things. She was, in his words, a calming presence. She dressed well, smiled at the right moments, and didn't talk about things she didn't understand. That was how he'd put it once, early in their marriage, and somehow she had let the words settle into her like a fact. She was 31 years old. She had a master's degree in urban planning from McGill. She spoke French fluently because she had grown up in Gatineau, on the Quebec side of the river, in a francophone household where English was something you learned for school and French was how you thought. Elliot knew none of this. In 7 years of marriage, he had never once asked where she had grown up. He assumed she was from somewhere anglophone and ordinary because she'd been living in Toronto when they met, and she supposed she had never corrected him because it had never seemed to matter. He had never asked. The conversation at the table shifted into French about 40 minutes into the first course. Lacroix was more comfortable in it, and Elliot followed along because he'd done enough business in Montreal to manage. He didn't speak it well, his grammar was rough and his accent was Ontarian, but he was confident the way men like him are always confident. He assumed understanding was something you could perform. Cassandra sat with her champagne and listened. Her? Lacroix asked in French, nodding toward her almost imperceptibly. She follows any of this? Elliot glanced at her the way you glance at a houseplant. Not a word, he said. She's sweet, but she's not really a business person, more of a a presence. He smiled. She volunteered at a community garden last summer. That's her speed. Lacroix made a small, polite sound that was neither agreement nor disagreement. She had some job in planning when we met, Elliot continued, lowering his voice slightly even though he clearly saw no reason to. I encouraged her to step back. It was stressful for her, and honestly it's better for us. She's happier now. Cassandra took a slow sip of champagne. She had not stepped back. She had been laid off during a restructuring at the city agency, where she worked, and had spent the following year building a freelance planning consultancy that now had 3 municipal clients and a federal contract she hadn't yet told Elliot about, because she'd been waiting for the right moment. That moment had not come in the way she'd imagined it would, and she won't be a problem, Elliot said, when the time comes to restructure things before the IPO. She signed a marriage agreement, standard terms. She gets the house if we split, nothing from the business. The house in Rosedale? Lacroix asked. That's the one. Cassandra set her glass down. She pressed her fingers flat against the tablecloth and breathed out once through her nose, quietly. The house in Rosedale had been purchased with proceeds from the sale of her grandmother's property in Gatineau. She had contributed $430,000 to that down payment. She had the documents at home, in the filing cabinet in the room. Elliot called the storage room and she called her office. He had never noticed the distinction. She smiled at the server who arrived to clear her plate. She thanked him in English. She asked if the halibut had been local. It had come from Nova Scotia, he said. She said that was wonderful. Elliot didn't look at her once. The rest of dinner passed the way these things do when you are quietly deciding the rest of your life. Cassandra smiled and nodded and occasionally touched her water glass. Inside, something cold and very clear had moved into the space where her uncertainty used to live. She was not angry. Not yet. Anger would come later, and it would be enormous. What she felt right now was more like the sensation of a door closing behind her. A quiet click. Lacroix addressed her in English once, near the end. He asked if she enjoyed the waterfront. She said she did. He said it reminded him of the old port in Montreal. She said, in French, that she thought so too, that she'd always found the St. Lawrence more dramatic in winter, something about the ice flows. Lacroix blinked, his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to respect. Elliot had gone very still. Cassandra turned to him pleasantly. Sorry, did I interrupt? He shook his head slowly. You speak French? It's my first language, she said, and she turned back to Lacroix and asked him, in French, whether his firm had previously invested in public infrastructure projects, or whether construction consulting was a new sector for them. They talked for 11 minutes while Elliot sat at his own dinner table in silence. She didn't overplay it. She didn't look at him with triumph. She just had the conversation, natural and easy, and then the evening ended the way it was always going to end, with handshakes and coats and the valet bringing the car around. Lacroix said goodnight to her with considerably more warmth than he had shown all evening. He gave her his card. He said he hoped they would speak again. In the car home, Elliot didn't turn on the radio. He usually turned on the radio. "How long?" he asked. "Since birth," she said. He didn't say anything else for the rest of the drive. She went to bed before he did. She lay in the dark and listened to him move around downstairs. The refrigerator opening, the TV going on low, the sound of a man who didn't know what to do with what he'd just learned. She felt the anger begin then, slow and deep, the way a river rises before you notice it flooding. She let it come. She didn't push it down. In the morning, Elliot had already left. There was no note. She made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the thin January light and did something she hadn't done in years. She opened the spreadsheet she kept on her personal laptop. The one on the personal laptop that Elliot had never touched, because it wasn't the nice one, it was the old one she'd had since her post-grad years. And she looked at everything she knew about their finances. She had been paying attention for 7 years. She had never had a reason to do anything with that attention. She had it now. She called her sister Dominique that afternoon. Dominique was 3 years older, lived in Ottawa, and worked as a family law paralegal. She had been skeptical of Elliot since the beginning in the way that older sisters are skeptical of men who are too charming and too certain and too quick to finish your sentences. "He said you get the house," Dominique said when Cassandra had finished talking. "The house you paid $400,000 toward." "Yes. While he takes the business. That's what the marriage agreement says, which you signed, which I signed when I was 24 and in love, and I didn't have anyone tell me to read it properly." A pause. "Okay," Dominique said. "Don't do anything yet. I'm going to call someone." The someone was a woman named Audra Mensah Collins, a family lawyer in Toronto with a reputation that made other lawyers slightly nervous. She had an office in a glass tower on Bay Street that looked like it was designed to make you feel small, and then you met her and realized the office was a misdirection. Audra herself was warm and direct and spoke the way people speak when they have never once needed to perform confidence, because the real thing has always been sufficient. They met 3 days later. Cassandra brought everything. The down payment records, the mortgage documents, the marriage agreement, 3 years of tax filings, and a folder she had quietly assembled from Elliot's home office the previous evening, while he was at a client dinner. She'd had his passwords since their first year of marriage. He gave them to her in case of emergencies. He had changed none of them. Audra reviewed the documents for 20 minutes in silence. "The marriage agreement has a problem," she said finally. Cassandra leaned forward. "What kind of problem?" "Your contribution to the down payment. $430,000 from your family's estate. It's documented, it predates the agreement, and it was never addressed in the property provisions. In Ontario, property brought into a marriage or inherited isn't automatically included in equalization. But a contribution this size toward a jointly titled matrimonial home, with documentation this clear." Audra tapped the folder. "His lawyers wrote this agreement to protect the business. They weren't thinking about the house because they assumed the house was his gift to you. They didn't realize you'd paid for most of it. So the agreement doesn't cover what it was meant to cover. Not entirely, and there's more." Audra opened another page. "His business, when was it incorporated?" "March 2019, and you were married in June 2018, so the business was incorporated during the marriage." "Yes. Were you working at the time?" Cassandra nodded. "I was still at the city. We had a joint account then. Some of our household costs came from that account during the period he was starting the business, which meant my income was effectively subsidizing his early operating costs." Audra looked at her for a moment. "You've thought about this." "I've had 3 days and I'm very good at spreadsheets." Audra smiled, just slightly, just enough. "The agreement tries to ring-fence the business as his sole property, but if marital funds contributed to the conditions that allowed the business to grow, and if we can demonstrate that your unpaid domestic and social contributions, hosting, networking, client entertainment, had direct value to his firm, we have grounds to challenge the ring fence." She paused. "This won't be simple, he'll fight it, but we're not in a weak position. What do I do?" "First, you don't tip your hand. Second, you secure copies of everything. Financial records, communications, anything that documents the business's trajectory. Third, and this is important, you do not move money in a way that looks irregular, but you do open accounts in your name alone. You're entitled to do that. Start building your own financial footing quietly, and the business going public in spring? Audra set down her pen. If that IPO proceeds before we file, the valuation gets locked in by market forces. His lawyers will argue for a valuation based on pre-IPO numbers, which will be significantly lower. If we can time our filing strategically, or at minimum ensure we have our own forensic accountant valuing the business independently, we protect your position. Cassandra looked out the window at Bay Street 20 floors below, the January slush gray and indifferent. He told his investor I wasn't a business person, she said, that I didn't understand these things. Men like that tend to assume the things they choose not to see don't exist, Audra said. It's usually their most expensive mistake. She drove home through the city in the early dark, the salt-grimed streets of downtown giving way to the quieter avenues of Rosedale. The house appeared at the end of the block, warm-lit and familiar. She had chosen the exterior paint color. She had planted the 2 serviceberry trees flanking the front steps. She had refinished the floors in the back study herself, over a long weekend when Elliot was in Calgary, because she'd wanted to know she could. She was not going to leave this house. She went inside, made tea, and sat down at her old laptop. The next 3 months had the texture of ordinary life on the surface and something completely different underneath. Cassandra made dinners, attended the social events Elliot expected her to attend, smiled at his colleagues, and kept a journal in a notebook she stored at Dominique's apartment in Ottawa. Every inconsistency. Every evening Elliot came home at 11 when his calendar said he'd finished at 7. Every receipt she found in the pocket of his dry cleaning that didn't match any client dinner he'd mentioned. She was not looking for something. She was simply paying attention, the way she had always paid attention, the way she'd always done it quietly, and to no particular acknowledgement. The acknowledgement was coming. She found the other thread by accident. She'd gone into his home office to retrieve a reference document for her own federal contract. She stored backups on the household network server because her laptop was old. And she had, while she was there, opened his email on the desktop out of something between habit and instinct. The correspondence was with a woman named Frederica Lowe, who was listed in his contacts as a senior associate at a rival planning firm. The email stretched back 14 months. They were not about planning. Cassandra photographed 43 screens without stopping. She forwarded everything to a new personal email account she had created under her maiden name, Fontaine. Then she closed everything, replaced the mouse exactly where it had been, and went to make herself another cup of tea. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The house was quiet around her. Through the back window she could see the yard, frozen and pale, the serviceberry trees bare against the fence. 14 months. She had been planning their anniversary trip to Portugal for 14 months. She had been building her federal contract for 14 months. She had been growing the 2 serviceberry trees for 3 years. Elliot had been spending 14 months with Frederica Lowe, and he had looked at Cassandra across dinner tables and said I love you at bedtime and put his hand on her back at charity events, and none of it had been real. She didn't cry. She thought she might, but she didn't. What she felt was something harder than grief, a kind of reckoning, cold and clean. Like finally getting the answer to a question you'd been too afraid to ask. She called Dominique. I found something else. How bad? 14 months. A colleague at Frederica Lowe Planning Group. A silence. Then Dominique said, under Ontario law, adultery itself doesn't change property division. But it might affect his credibility. And if they've been spending time together using shared funds, there are hotel charges on an account I have access to. 9 times in 14 months, send me everything. I'll get it to Audra tonight. Audra called the following morning. This changes our timeline, she said. Not the legal outcomes but the strategy. He's not going to want any of this examined in court. The IPO investors will not love learning their prospective CEO has been conducting a 14-month affair on corporate expense accounts. A brief pause. I want to file before the IPO. We're ready. Are you ready? Cassandra stood at the window of her home office. Her office, the one Elliot called the storage room, and looked at the street below. Yes, she said. She was ready. The papers were served on a Thursday in late March. Elliot came home to find them on the kitchen counter, beside a cup of tea she had made and left to cool because she had not wanted to be there when he arrived. She was at Dominique's by then, in Ottawa, sitting in her sister's warm, slightly cluttered living room eating takeout butter chicken, and watching her phone light up with messages she didn't open. Dominique filled her wine glass without being asked. He's called 4 times, Cassandra noted. Don't answer. I'm not answering. The weeks that followed were not pleasant. Elliot's lawyers fought with the energy of people who had promised their client an easy outcome, and were now discovering the terrain was more complicated than advertised. They challenged the down payment records. Audra produced the original estate documentation and the wire transfer confirmation. They challenged the marital contribution to business growth. Audra's forensic accountant produced 4 years of joint account statements showing household overhead costs that had freed Elliot to operate his business without personal debt during its formative period. They argued the marriage agreement was binding and comprehensive. Audra pointed to the paragraphs that failed to account for a jointly titled property purchased primarily with one spouse's inherited capital. The hotel receipts came up. Elliot's lawyers tried to characterize them as business expenses. The hotel in question was a boutique property in Niagara-on-the-Lake with a spa and a well-reviewed wine cellar. It was not a common venue for construction consulting meetings. Meanwhile, 2 of Lacroix's associates contacted Cassandra's planning consultancy about a potential contract. Lacroix had apparently mentioned her to them. She took the meetings. They went well. She found out about the IPO complications through a press release, which she read on her phone while waiting for Audra outside the mediator's office. Sterling Capital, the lead underwriter for Elliot's firm, had delayed the offering pending clarification of certain outstanding legal matters, including the principal's personal circumstances. Elliot's PR team released a brief statement about a private family matter. The business press was mildly interested for about 48 hours and then moved on. She did not feel triumphant when she read it. She felt tired, and then she felt something more solid than tired. A kind of settled rightness, the way it feels when a weight you didn't know you were carrying is finally set down. The mediation produced an agreement in May. The terms took 2 full days to negotiate. Cassandra kept the house in Rosedale. She received a cash settlement reflecting her contribution to the business growth during the incorporation period. Her forensic accountant had valued this at $380,000. And they met in the middle. She was awarded her full interest in the household investments and accounts held jointly. The marriage agreement was amended by consent, because the alternative was a court proceeding that Elliot's lawyers had made clear their client did not want, given the current circumstances. Frederica Lowe was not in the room, but she was present anyway, the way consequences always are. Elliot looked diminished when Cassandra saw him at the final signing. Not dramatically. He was still well dressed, still groomed. But something had gone out of him. The certainty, maybe. The particular kind of certainty that belongs to people who have never had to account for what they assume. She didn't speak to him beyond what was necessary. She signed her name, Cassandra Fontaine Marsh, using both surnames for the first time in years. She walked out onto Bay Street into a May afternoon that smelled like thaw and rain and the beginning of something. Dominique was waiting outside, leaning against the building in her work clothes, her arms crossed against the cool air. She pushed off the wall when she saw Cassandra coming through the glass doors. Well? Cassandra lifted her face to the gray spring sky. Done. They went for dinner. Not somewhere fancy, just a Portuguese place near Dominique's office in the annex. The kind of place with communal tables and good wine and no agenda. They talked about their mother, who had died 3 years ago and whose land sale had funded the down payment that had, in the end, given Cassandra her footing. They talked about Dominique's daughter, who was learning to read and had recently become very serious about snails. They talked about the federal brawl contract which was going well and the Lacroix connection which might go somewhere. Around 9, Dominique asked, "What are you going to do with the house?" Cassandra turned her wine glass in her hands. "Keep it for now. I'm converting the bottom unit into an office. Proper signage." She paused. Fontaine Planning Group. Dominique looked at her for a moment. Then she raised her glass. They clinked without ceremony, the way sisters do. Over the next year, the thing Cassandra had quietly built in the margins of her marriage became the thing at the center of her life. She hired 2 associates. She took on a contract with the city of Ottawa that required her to be there every other week, which meant she saw Dominique regularly, which meant her niece began to know her as something more than a voice on a phone. She submitted a paper to a planning journal about adaptive reuse and community infrastructure that got a response she hadn't expected, including an invitation to speak at a conference in Vancouver. She went to Vancouver. She gave her talk. People asked good questions. She ran into Bertrand Lacroix at an urban development conference in Montreal in the autumn. He recognized her immediately and shook her hand with warmth. He asked how her firm was developing. She told him. He listened in the way people listen when they're actually interested, not just performing interest. At the end of the conversation he said, your former husband, his offering did not go well." "I heard that," she said, a shame in some ways. "The firm had potential." He tilted his head slightly. He had a habit, I think, of not seeing what was directly in front of him. "Yes," Cassandra said. He did. Lacroix smiled. Well, it is fortunate then, that what was in front of him has found a better place to be. She thought about that on the flight home, the flat winter dark of the St. Lawrence visible below through a break in the cloud cover. She thought about the dinner at Harbor Grand, the champagne glass that hadn't shaken. The words she had heard and chosen to absorb and carry away and do something with instead of something else. Elliot had looked at her across a table for 7 years and seen a woman who didn't understand things. She had sat across from him and understood everything. The contracts, the finances, the social landscape he was navigating, the way his ego required witnesses and preferred them silent. She had understood all of it and said nothing because she had believed, in some deep and poorly examined part of herself, that this was what love looked like. Making yourself smaller so someone else had more room. She knew better now. The plane descended through the cloud cover and the lights of Toronto spread out below her. The grid of the downtown core, the waterfront, the long dark edge of the lake. Her city, or one of them. She had two now. She was building a third in the pages of the planning work she'd been doing for almost a decade. The one made of infrastructure and public space, and the careful thought about how people move through the world. It was the best kind of city, the kind no one could take from her. She landed just before midnight and took the train in from the airport, her carry-on in the overhead rack, her phone dark in her bag. She didn't need to check anything. She was going home.